One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was an immensely popular film released in 1975, starring Jack Nicholson as R.P. McMurphy and Louise Fletcher as Nurse Ratched. It was based on the 1962 book by Ken Kesey that follows a group of patients in a mental facility as their whole routine is disturbed by new patient and rabble-rouser R.P. McMurphy. But this film does more than just tell a story. As a huge success, financially lucrative and critically acclaimed, it can be seen as both a reflection of that era's previously held beliefs and an influential factor in how Americans started to view psychiatric institutions at the time. Before we get into the film, let's look at the time period in which it was released. A lot happened in 1975. Wheel of Fortune premiered on NBC. Mel B, my personal favorite Spice Girl, was born. The Watergate scandal was in full swing, and, of course, the U.S. finally pulled out of the Vietnam War.
They care not about high-level decisions. Their theme song is a happy one, probably sung to the tune of Jingle Bells. It's out of the steaming jungles to their homes from Maine to California. Merry Christmas from Uncle Sam.
Those last two might have a little bit more cultural relevance to this topic. From the 60s into the 70s, the span which popularized both Kesey's novel and the film adaptation, America was in a state of disillusionment with its institutions. The Watergate scandal, for instance, marks a huge turning point in Americans' relationship with their government. Of course, there are always those unhappy with who's in power, but after reports of Nixon's corruptions, he became the first president impeached since Andrew Johnson in 1868. A similar disillusionment was pushed forward by the Tet Offensive, which exposed the toll the Vietnam War was taking on American troops.
Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest. For the most part orderly, minor scuffles did occur between the demonstrators and hecklers.
Journalistic evidence of the mass tragedies directly contradicted the government's promises of proximity to victory, again making the people question who they could really trust.
The two-day protest ends with over 600 arrested and the widespread opinion that the demonstration made everyone a loser.
In his book, The Making of a Counterculture, Theodore Roszak argues that this rebellion of the general populace was in response not only to an untrustworthy government, but to what he calls the technocracy, the government or control of society or industry by an elite of technical experts. It's this control that the people rebelled against. There was a pushback against the power that institutions, experts, and authorities held over the average man, under the guise of looking out for them and keeping them safe. It's easiest to see this public outrage in protests like those which followed the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. However, Roszak argues that a less aggressive faction of the same mindset could be found among the crowd at Woodstock, the drug-addled, hippie, flower child aesthetic demonstrating the same air of disobedience and rebellion in a very different way. While not all Woodstock-era hippies spoke out directly, Roszak says that by asserting pleasure and freedom as human rights, they were sending a message, asking questions of those forces that insisted, amid obvious affluence, on the continued necessity of discipline, no matter how subliminal. This mindset, as much chaotic and hedonistic as free and empowered, is embodied by Jack Nicholson's character, R.P. McMurphy, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. New York Times reviewer Vincent Cadby called him a free spirit and the fast-talking hero of the film. His tendency towards rash action, both in speech and physical altercations, and his rebellion against the authority of the hospital make R.P. McMurphy the poster child for Roszak's counterculture.
Come on, you're not gonna say that now. You're not gonna say that now. You're gonna pull that henhouse shit now. When the vote, the chief just voted, it was 10-9. Now I want that television set turned on right now!
The environment in the film also fits Roszak's description of the technocracy. Vincent Canby's same New York Times review describes the plot of the film as a duel between Randall and Nurse Ratched for the remnants of the minds of the other patients in the ward. So if McMurphy is the rebel, then Nurse Ratched is the epitome of the technocracy. Put in a position of power by her expert status as a nurse, she's portrayed as a power-hungry woman using her position to manipulate others. This reflects a shift of the time. Whereas most previous distrust in institutions had stemmed from a fear that professionals were incapable of doing a proper job on a purely ability level, in this time period, and up to the present, it stems from the idea of moral corruption obstructing experts' duties. So looking through the lens of institutional distrust, of the technocracy and the rebel, this seems to be a classic dichotomy. Good versus evil, hero versus villain. But does that hold up in an objective look at the film? I would say yes, but only in part. There are certainly admirable moments in McMurphy's rebellions, and horrible deeds done by the corrupt Nurse Ratched, but I would argue that they're both far more complicated characters than the simple black and white spectrum would have you believe. I mean, I don't know about you, but on my first watch, and all subsequent watches really, I didn't find McMurphy to be a particularly likable character.
Of course, it's true that you went in for statutory rape.
Doc, she was 15 years old, going on 35, Doc, and between you and me, she might have been 15, but you get that little red beaver right up there in front of you. I don't think it's crazy at all.
There are certainly scenes where his rebellion is for the cause, as it were, but scenes like this one, in which he sprays his fellow inmates with a hose, or this one, where he messes with one of the orderlies, shows that McMurphy's rebellion isn't always particularly heroic. Even at times when he is fighting against the man, quote-unquote, it can feel erratic and violent, out of control. Neither the patients, who are also victims of Nurse Ratched, or the peaceful orderly not abusing his power, are a part of the technocracy that needs rebelling against. It seems to me that, although McMurphy's actions do end up taking a stand against the oppressive forces of the asylum, that it's more by mere happenstance than heroism. His rash and hedonistic tendencies seem to be more than a political stance for R.P. McMurphy. They're just a part of who he is, and, when scrutinized, they don't necessarily paint him as someone you'd want to hang out with for an extended period of time. I think it's possible, and quite plausible, that the prominent views of the time had as much to do with how Randall McMurphy's character was received as did the writing of the character itself. But just as the attitudes of the era affected the response to the film affected the public's response to the topic, mental institutions. According to a history of psychology written in 2005, although prior to World War II, American psychiatry was characterized by methods including hydrotherapy, electroconvulsive therapy, and lobotomy, by the 1960s, only a few true devotees continued to perform these operations. However, it's these gruesome methods that were stuck in the public's mind. Photographs from the early to mid-20th century show what looked like torture devices used to subdue and theoretically cure the mental illnesses plaguing patients. Ken Kesey's novel further dramatized, as fiction tends to do, the usage of these methods. The book's publication contributed to a backlash against the entire psychiatric treatment system in the U.S. in the 1960s. Huge spirit-crushing institutions, such as the Oregon facility, later depicted in the film, began reducing their excessive resident numbers and granting patients more rights. Data collected by the Center for Health Services, Substance Abuse, and Mental Health Services Administration found that while the number of institutions in existence didn't fluctuate heavily, the number of long-standing patients in those institutions decreased drastically starting in the 1940s. The biggest drops are seen from around 1965 to 1980, from just after Kesey's book's release to a bit after the movie's production and success. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is also seen to have catalyzed the development of more effective antipsychotic drugs that allowed more patients to be treated at home and lead more normal lives. This random sampling of patients from Stockholm State Hospital found that by 1964, antipsychotic drugs were the only method of treatment for over half of all psychotic patients and more than 75% of non-psychotic patients who received treatment. At the time of the film's release, despite the fact that the methods being shown were already diminishing in popularity, the visceral, hard-to-watch images presented continued to make a stir.
Okay, this won't hurt, and it'll be over in just a moment.
Uh-huh. What's that?
A study published in 1983 of college students found that those who watched the film developed considerably more negative attitudes, not only towards mental health facilities, but towards people with mental health issues in general. Amid a minor revival of electroconvulsive therapy in the early 1990s, the New York Times noted that thanks to the film, in the public mind, shock therapy retained the tarnished image given to it by Ken Kesey's novel, dangerous, inhumane, and overused. Even decades later, we still haven't shaken the scenes of wicked Nurse Ratched torturing innocent patients. The painful image of Jack Nicholson in the electric chair forever ruined the procedure's reputation, as did the haunting image of the once boisterous R.P. McMurphy re-entering the ward as a zombie after his lobotomy. As a film that received immense critical acclaim, a film that's still watched and discussed today, the impact of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest on the American view of psychiatry and psychiatric institutions is incredibly significant. That being said, it's also a window offering a look at how Americans viewed psychiatric institutions, and institutions in general, at that time period. Part of the film's success, after all, must be owed to its relatability. It was a story, at the time, that people wanted to hear, as well as one that affected their outlook.